Welcome to Lesson 6.4. I can identify congruent polygons. Some familiar language, congruent, and polygons. So let's have our vocabulary out, write down good questions, and follow along using your own notes or the printed notes from Moodle. So, congruent polygons. Polygons that have the same size and the same shape are called congruent polygons. So I always think of congruent, and again, this is the symbol for congruent, if I can write that with my stylus. Symbol for congruent means same shape and same size. So you'll see, if two polygons are congruent, their corresponding sides, remember that corresponding means in the same position, are congruent, and their corresponding angles, same position, are congruent as well. So notice we have two figures here, triangle ABC and triangle FGH. So we notice that A corresponds with F, B corresponds with G, and C corresponds with H. So some congruent angles that we see are that A and F are the same, and they're denoted right there with those pink lines, as well as B and G are congruent, and C and H are congruent. Congruent sides, meaning they have the same length, and these are denoted again by those pink lines. So we see that BC is the same as GH, AC is the same as FH, and AB is the same as FG. So they're congruent, and since all angles and sides are congruent, the figures, the polygons, are also congruent. Here's how you write a congruent statement, and you're going to be asked to do this in your classwork, so make sure that you have this down. In a congruent statement, the letters identifying each polygon are written so that the corresponding vertices appear in the same order. So essentially we want them to have their corresponding part attached to it. So for example, even though these are flipped around, if we flip this over, we could tell, and by the angle marks, we can tell that B and Q actually correspond. So notice that they are both in the middle there. The vertex B corresponds with Q. And we can see that C corresponds with P, so they're also in that first spot. And we see that D and R correspond, so they're lined up. So what this says, if I were to read this, it says triangle CBD is congruent with triangle PQR. So again, two polygons are congruent if all pairs of corresponding angles are congruent and all pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. Notice that definition keeps coming up. So here we're going to be asked to determine whether the triangles shown are congruent. And if they are, name the corresponding parts and write a congruent statement. So there are a lot of different ways depending on how you start, the way you order it. So for example, some of us could do YXZ, while some of us might start with XYZ. So as long as you're consistent, there might be a couple different ways to write it. So the arcs here indicate that angle X is congruent with angle M. They also indicate that angle Y is congruent with angle N, and they indicate that angle Z is congruent with angle L. So they also indicate with these measures, knowing that this one says 6 and this says 6, that line segment XY, and it's written like that, is congruent with line segment, no, let's go by the same vertice, MN. So since I put M first because I put X first and those angles correspond, also tells me that XZ corresponds with ML, and it also tells me that YZ corresponds with NL. So since that all of the angles and all of the sides are congruent, then I can say that triangle XYZ is congruent to triangle MNL. Again, noticing that the corresponding parts are lined up with each other within that congruent statement. Why don't you try? Determine whether the polygons shown are congruent. If so, name the corresponding parts and write a congruent statement. So on this one, I'm going to write, yes, I think that they are. The reason being because I see that angle P corresponds with angle C. They're both 50. I see that angle Q corresponds with angle B. They're at 40. And I see that angle R corresponds with angle D at 90 degrees. I also have to take into account my line segments. So I see that line segment PR is congruent to CD. Notice the corresponding parts are lined up. RQ corresponds with DB, as well as PQ is corresponding with CB. So my whole congruent statement then, I would call them the triangles. So I would say triangle PQR, and again there's multiple ways, some of you might have said QRP, is congruent with, so if I started with P, I have to start with C on this one, B, D. Again, there are variations how you can write that as long as the corresponding parts are in the same place. On this one, I can see that they're all right angles, but because this corresponding side and this corresponding side are not the same, they are not congruent. So I do not have a congruent statement to write. Find the measure of angle Q. So again, I'm given this information, and they're telling me right now that they are congruent. So I'm going to fill in information that I do know. So I see that A is supposed to correspond with Q. And right here, if I'm given A is 40, then Q is also 40 degrees. Tells me H corresponds with N. So this must be 65. And I don't really need to fill in the rest because I've already answered my question. It says find the measure of angle Q. So according to the congruent statement is what I have written here. Type that in. I think. According to the congruent statement, and then I would write the measurements, angle, and this I'm just going to type angle A is congruent to angle Q. So because I know that, kind of way there. Because I know that, then that means that the measure of A is congruent to the measure of angle Q. So the measure of angle Q is also 40 degrees. So it's again using what you know to find what you don't know. That might come with me. All right, and then the bottom. Screen might be locked. On the bottom, we're going to look for RN. And so we're going to see what corresponds. It looks like RN corresponds with FH. So if FH is 9, so if FH corresponds to Rn, then FH is congruent with Rn. So taking what we know to solve what we don't know. So that means that the length of Rn must also be 9 inches. Try a little extra practice if you need to, and go back and rewatch what you can. Make sure you have examples written down and that you took your time and that you come to class with questions. See you soon.